Hello, and welcome to our lesson on crisis management. In this segment, we'll continue discussing crisis management phases. If the diagnosis process indicates that the performance implications of a detected problem fall within acceptable tolerances, the crisis management process terminates at that point. However, if a comparator perceives an unacceptable threat, the process progresses to the next stage, which involves formulating an appropriate response. This is the responsibility of a person who has the authority to make the necessary decision to bring actual performance levels back into line with project goals. A decision can only be made by one person, even though it may be with the advice of many. Decision-making problems. Problems of monitoring and diagnosis influence the efficiency of the decision-making process, but numerous problems are also peculiar to the process, such as conflicting advice, decision-making problems, dealing with external constituencies, irrationality, and reluctance to alter performance standards. Conflicting advice. Essentially, the decision-maker's task is to choose from a range of alternative courses of action. These decisions may be self-generated, or recommendations can come from specialist comparators who are more qualified to make such judgments. This creates the need to synthesize potentially conflicting advice from a wide range of comparators. Centralized decision-making authority. Crises are events of significant magnitude, and they would normally command the attention of higher-level decision-makers, such as the project manager and occasionally the client. The level of decision-making invoked is also likely to depend on the degree to which decision-making authority is decentralized. A decentralized structure facilitates lower-level decision-making. This issue of hierarchical location is an important consideration in crisis management because the closer the decision-makers to a threat, the faster the response, as the need for communication between organizational levels decreases. Highly centralized structures are slow to adapt to change. This results in poor decisions that are based on the distorted and restricted judgments of one individual. Dealing with external constituencies, irrationality, reluctance to alter performance standards. One characteristic of a crisis is that it affects high-level decision-makers. The implications of the most high-profile crises are likely to go through the top of an organization and implicate external stakeholders such as financiers, insurers, users, public pressure groups, unions, government departments, and others affected in the project, such as subcontractors and suppliers. The external constituencies will need to be considered, informed of proposed solutions, and in extreme circumstances, handed the entire responsibility to deal with a crisis. For example, in the case of a site fatality, subsequent investigations by the Health and Safety Inspectorate or union officials may deem that a site be closed until certain improvements are made. Similarly, in the case of bankruptcy, legally appointed company administrators, liquidators, or accountants may temporarily take responsibility for managing a project. Dealing with the rights of external constituencies can be a complex, delicate, and highly political process, with significant potential to exacerbate a crisis and delay response. Consequently, responsibilities for integrating these stakeholders into the decision-making process must be clearly defined in advance. A decision-maker's task is to make a decision, and the decision-maker can follow a number of alternative routes. When a decision-maker has experienced a similar problem in the past, he or she tends to follow the cognitive routines that were developed for that situation. A decision-maker will make an automatic decision by relying on a predetermined response. In contrast, when a problem is unusual, non-routine, and not anticipated in people's cognitive routines, they tend to follow an analytical process, assessing the costs and benefits of various alternatives. When a problem is unique, complex, surrounded by uncertainty, and difficult to measure in terms of its costs and benefits, decision-makers use a purely cognitive model in which a person would make an intuitive decision based on gut feelings. Often during the pressures and stresses of a crisis, decision-makers are unlikely to follow the rational paths. A decision, whether it is automatic, analytical, or intuitive, should realign organizational performance and planned goals. With this goal, a decision-maker may legitimately decide to do nothing if there is a possibility of the deviation correcting itself in time. In most instances, something will have to change, and this can either be planned goals or existing performance levels. One other alternative is to attempt to reverse the force that is causing the deviation. While the pressures to alter performance rather than goals may be high on some major projects, it may be the opposite on other projects. Under the pressures of a crisis, standards that once appeared reasonable tend to appear unattainable and are likely to be relaxed because of the alleviating effect this produces. Crises have widespread social, technical, and monetary implications, and any decision is likely to require a significant change in these aspects of an organization. Technical implications relate to modifications in the physical routines of the project. Social implications relate to the way in which project members must alter their established patterns of relationships. And monetary implications relate to the extra resources required to implement those changes. In a highly interdependent organization, such changes are brought about through a network of communications that originates from a decision maker and spreads throughout the organizational structure. Implementation problems. Problems implementing decisions are likely to arise for a number of reasons, such as poor communication, resistance to change, and external constituencies. If implementation takes place through a network of communications between project members, then any communication problems will reduce the effectiveness of the crisis management process. There is a high potential for communications to be damaged during a sudden crisis because of information overload and people's natural tendency to panic, become irrational, and shut down certain senses. Aside from the natural phenomena, the nature of the industry can also contribute to communication breakdowns during a crisis. Communication difficulties may arise from historical divisions between the organization's professions, fragmentation of the process due to subcontracting practices, sequential procurement systems that separate projects' phases, such as design and construction, and conflicts of interests due to tendering and contractual practices. These problems create underlying tensions in all projects, and it is during the pressures of a crisis that they are likely to be exacerbated and to surface by damaging the effectiveness of interactions among individuals. Implementation involves technical, monetary, and social change, to which there is likely to be a natural level of resistance. People resist because all change requires the abandonment of past efforts and considerable rework. When risks are not shared, change will inevitably create both winners and losers. Although winners are likely to support such change, they are providing only a light support for change efforts compared to the vigorous defense of the status quo from potential losers. The problems of integrating external constituencies into the crisis management process were considered in relation to the decision-making phase, and they are mirrored during implementation. In this phase, they can be more acute because the implementation process is likely to be more lengthy and widespread in its implications for organizational members than the decision-making process. In the temporary environment of projects, the integration of external constituencies is particularly difficult because there is little time to build a long-term working relationship with them. Another factor that causes difficulties in integrating external agencies into crisis management activities is the transient nature of the project workforces. For example, the difficulties of integrating into the crisis management process subcontractors who will soon be completing their work and moving to another project, being funded by a different client, and being organized by another contractor. This is the end of this segment of our lesson. In the next segment, we will continue discussing crisis management phases. This course is presented to you by South Europe College. Thank you for listening, and see you on our next segment.